Welcome to Your College Bound Kid,
a podcast for parents, college counselors, students, and anyone who wants a weekly deep dive into the world of college admissions.
Hi, I'm Susan, and I'm a college counselor and have read applications for a small liberal arts college and 2 research universities. My twins are recent college graduates.
I'm Lisa, and I'm a clinical psychologist and college counselor. I have a daughter in college, a daughter in high school, and a son in middle school. After 30 years in Chicago, we recently moved to North Carolina.
My name is Mark. I'm a college coach in Atlanta and the parent of 2 daughters. Karis, a graduate of Davidson College, and she is the founder of the Spanish tutoring company, SpanishHelpToday.com. And Joy is a graduate of the University of Georgia, and she is getting her master's degree at North Carolina State University. This week in the news, Susan's my co-pilot, and we will be looking at an article in the Chronicle for Higher Ed called The Haves and the Have-Nots of Higher Education. And the subtitle is Higher Ed is Increasingly Becoming Unequal. It's by Robert Kelchen. Our question comes from Ellie from New York, and she wants to know, when is the best time for a student to take a gap year? We'll continue our interview with Akil Bello on tough questions about test scores with part 2 of 4. We'll get the final part of Lisa's College Spotlight on McGill University. Hi, Susan.
Hey, how are you, Mark? Great to see you.
Yeah, likewise. Are you getting ready for your annual excursion to Maine that you take every year?
I am. We're going to, having lived there for a dozen years or more after college and starting my admissions career there, it's always a pleasure to go back. And I'm happy to go back in the summer as opposed to the winter, even though
Sure.
I enjoyed it thoroughly.
Well, as long as I've known you, you've been taking the summer trek to Maine. I think this is an annual thing that's got to be getting close to 30 years or so, isn't it for you?
It is. I left Maine to go to Westtown in
1990.
91.
91, yeah.
So my first class was not the class of 92.
Right.
And I started actually going back because I had the summers off for the first time, in my short life at that point. I was teaching in the counselor education program at the University of Southern Maine, which was—
I didn't know that.
Well, it was the counselor education program that I had graduated from, that I had done part-time while I was working full-time in admissions. And they were a K-CREP accredited program. You and I have discussed that before.
Yep.
And the recommendation was that these programs with this high level of accreditation start teaching a class focusing on college admissions counseling and financial aid. So they asked me so I graduated from the program, had written my thesis. I had been invited to write 5 chapters for the first textbook for college counseling as an academic class. So the counselor educator who got hold of me somehow asked me to write chapters on standardized testing, how colleges make admissions decisions, and a couple different things. And the university let me count that as my master's thesis. Otherwise,
that was good.
Yeah, I would not have been able to do it. I just would not. So then they said, well, so you're leaving and moving to Pennsylvania to work at this cool school. If you come back, could we entice you to teach in the counselor ed program in the summer? So what they used to do in the summer is offer shorter classes. You could still knock off 3 credit hours, but it was, you could teach a half a day over 3 weeks, or you could teach 5 full days, 8 hours in the week. And I said, well, I'm not giving up any more of my summertime than I need to. So I designed this course, and the people who took it were either finishing the master's in school counseling program, or they were already school counselors mostly in public high schools in Maine, but feeling bereft of any background in the whole college admissions and financial aid piece. And it was just— I did it for a couple summers. It was just an absolutely wonderful experience. Put the book to good use that I had contributed to. And, and then I kind of got to the point where I was like, why am I doing this to myself during the summer?
Enjoy that summer off.
Boarding school work is exhausting.
Yeah.
And when my kids were born, I decided to lay down the work during the summer. So that was my excuse, but I enjoyed it thoroughly. And, I have lots of old friends who live in Maine, and I don't think there's anything as beautiful as the southern beaches there. A little chilly. The water's on the cold side, not like you guys down south. But I look forward to it a lot. Thanks for asking.
Awesome. So Susan's going to share a tip for us today on the additional information section. I've asked her to share when she's reading files, what she finds helpful or maybe not helpful when she's reading that section. So take it wherever you want to go, Susan.
Oh, well, thanks, Mark. It's a topic I love to talk about, and working now with, rising seniors, with many of the students I'm working with now remotely, as you do too, of course. We're getting them ready to move into a summer filled with productive application and essay writing, right? So I draw heavily on my winter months experience when I'm reading applications for a university. And this is the third institution I've read for. So I've kind of done the small liberal arts college and then these two wonderful research universities. I find, and you've heard me say this before, that the application to me is a jigsaw puzzle, and I'm looking at one hanging on my wall here in my office, right? And, individually, the pieces matter very little. They could be pretty or attractive, and you might be able to guess at what they are representing, but it's not until you put them together that you see the full picture that the puzzle was created to represent. And the application is very, very much the same way. And I never tire of this example, because I think when kids sit down to start working on their application, they tend to just jump in, fill it out. I would do the same thing. It's just, you want to get it over with. It's like a passport application. You just start at the beginning and power through, or your taxes, or, whatever it is that you're applying for. And really what I do with juniors right now is I try and get them to actually start at the end and think about the top of the jigsaw puzzle box. When you look at a new puzzle, you look at the box top and you say, oh, and you think about, where are logical places to begin putting it all together. And I think kids really benefit when they say, well, what do I want colleges to know about me and understand about me when they're done? So when they click off, the application, what are the conclusions I want them to have drawn about me from reading my application? And in a way, when you start at the conclusion, and actually this benefits some kids also when they're writing their essays, is, write your conclusion first. Sometimes that helps with the rest of the essay. But if you start with what you want the picture to look like, then you can start assembling the pieces in a way that creates that coherent picture. The narrative, the story, the credentials. Kids have control over parts of the application. Some of it they don't. It's fill in the blank. It's, here's your transcript. Your test scores are going to go here. We've talked a lot about, well, they're picking their recommenders, right? So they kind of do that, anticipating what they know those people are going to say about them. But there's this part of the application, whether it's the Common or the Coalition, or even a lot of the individual university systems that still have their own applications, like California, where there's a bit of a blank canvas in the application, and it's generally optional. And basically what the application is saying, as Taylor Swift so beautifully said, I've got a blank space, baby.
You're showing your youthfulness.
That's my daughter's fandom.
Yeah, I figured that.
It's my daughter's
kids will
fandom.
keep us youthful.
But you got a blank space there, and it's optional in the Common App. It follows the community disruption statement, which is also optional, which follows the personal statement, which is required by many colleges and optional for some of the less selective colleges that don't feel like they need a writing sample or a personal essay. But so many of the kids that you and I work with and have worked with over our careers are required to write that personal statement. I think when a student starts thinking about their application with the conclusion instead of the preamble, then they understand what's going to be missing as they start addressing the individual pieces. They just realize that there are some things that could be said, should be said to help a college draw the right conclusions about them through their application.
I think some examples might be helpful. If you can think of some examples, it might be helpful for listeners. Yeah.
So when I get to the additional information section in the Common App, on the reader's platform, which is it's like looking at a PDF, the same PDF that a student would look like if they did a preview at the end. It's the last piece of writing, but it's basically on the same screen as the personal statement and the community disruption statement. So the reader's eye is going 1, 2, 3. It's not like they have to click on another page if they want to see the additional information. It just kind of flows. So it's very noticeable. Kids don't necessarily realize this when they're filling it out on the Common App because it involves them clicking through to another page. Also, the wording of the additional information section. First is the community disruption statement. Colleges care about the effects on your health and well-being, safety, family circumstances, future plans, and education. And they invite you to comment on that in a 250-word space. Then what comes next is, do you wish to provide details of circumstances or qualifications not reflected in the application? And when the student checks yes, there's a 650 space that opens up, which is equivalent to the personal statement. So what do I see there when I'm reading for a university? I would say only about half of the applications include one or both of these optional sections. Now, I don't know what that would be like at, an Ivy League school or at, another place, but this is, from what I hear, pretty typical.
I think it's more typical of selective schools still, and maybe selective privates. I think if we were to look at certainly regional publics and flagships, I think as well, I can ask there. I think those numbers are going to be lower from the people.
They're going to be lower. You heard, in fact, that maybe closer to 10%.
Yeah, at some schools.
Right.
Yeah, at some schools. So it does, when you have more affluent students coming from well-resourced schools getting coaching.
Yes.
Then you'll see more people take advantage of this, because we know admission officers oftentimes have unanswered questions, and this can be a great place to answer unanswered questions. You're reading to try to admit, but I can't. Why did you not take that class? And some of these kinds of things, like, that's your opportunity. I had a student this week that said, I'd like to take fourth year French, but it's also offered at the exact same time as AP Science. What do I do? And so, it's one thing. Admission officers can't read minds. And if they know that, look, I wanted to take these, but they weren't available, that's a different read than, you intentionally chose to not take rigor. And
that's right. And why'd you stop that prematurely? Well, and that's just not information that's going to be in the school profile. Some students think, like I met with a student today who is applying to engineering programs, and I noticed in grades 9 through 11, he had not had physics, so I assumed he's taking it senior year. And he said, I'm taking physics. And I said, which one? He said, I'm taking AP physics. And I said, which one? And he said, well, there's only one. And I said, well, what is the name of the AP class? Because we know there are like 3 of them. And the big difference is between algebra-based physics and calculus-based physics on the AP. And usually the algebra-based physics AP is taken earlier in high school, and often for a STEM kid followed, especially an engineering applicant, followed by the C class later on. And he said, oh, well, I don't know, this is the only one. This was my only option. He goes, I don't even know what you mean. And I said, well, okay, I get it. So the first thing you're going to do is look at your school profile and see what's listed in terms of the curriculum in physics, and if it's clear. And I said that would be a good thing, but a lot of high schools don't think about doing that. They don't realize that might be something that an admissions person is going to do when they see a transcript of an engineering applicant who hasn't had physics, until 12th grade. And I said, this is something you should put on your little checklist of things to explain, and maybe ask your guidance counselor too, in their letter, in your support, if that could be something that they would corroborate, that this was the only, Now, I said, you didn't go outside of the school to try and find a class like that on your own. He then interrupted me and he said, oh, but I started doing these little online classes early on, things like, at MIT, you could sign up for this free series of lectures and in this, and then there was this Coursera computer engineering thing I did. And I'm like, oh my goodness. I said, so let's talk about how you're going to use the additional information section to kind of unpack all these things that you've chosen to teach yourself, right? So thematically, he kind of struck gold in bringing that up, because we hadn't discussed it before. And so I would say the primary use of additional information is to explain stuff, whatever that is, explain your journey, the courses that you wished you'd taken, but you couldn't take, or the fact that coming out of the pandemic, your school, you had started in Mandarin and then they eliminated it from your high school. So you had to start over with a new language, and just kind of explanatory, almost kind of reporting information. Now, in additional information, this does not have to be an essay. It's not inviting you to submit an essay. It's inviting you to submit information. So a lot of students who use it tend to write discrete paragraphs, often with titles that identify for the reader the content in that paragraph, and they keep it short and to the point. And it's very explanatory and very helpful. They might also elaborate on extracurricular activities that deserve a little bit more explanation than they can fit in the activities, family responsibility, and work list.
So I want to stop you there, because I think that is a really great opportunity that a lot of students miss. Where students are frustrated with 150 characters. And how can you not be? You spent 4 years on something. You have to reduce it to 150 characters. Oh, my
goodness, yes.
But it's one way to really accentuate a passion and to show, this is an area I care really deeply about. And that's why, you and I are of the opinion that most students need to take advantage of this, because you may not have some perceived deficiency. Like, we could go through all of them. Like, you had low grades in 9th or 10th grade because your grandmother passed and you're really close to her, or something like that. Those are things that deserve attention in this section. But maybe you don't have something like that, but you can accentuate a positive. And I've seen that used really skillfully and adroitly, where you can really make your description of an activity really robust.
Absolutely.
And I think it's a really powerful way to let an admission officer know, I really care deeply about this, and here's some of the things I've done. I mean, we know they're supposed to order them according to their priorities, but still 150 characters is so limiting.
It is, absolutely. And the bad use of additional information is just like a laundry list. It's like, oh, well, I could only put 10 things on my activities list, so now I'm going to put 10 more.
I've seen them.
Yeah, I know. And it's, quantity, you don't get points for quantity.
No. Admission officers know there's 24 hours in a day.
That's
and
right.
You couldn't have gone deep on everything.
And they really only care about what's kind of driving the list at the top, and the initiative and involvement and the legacy you're leaving. But all that may be cheapened if you don't add some explanatory information. Now, sometimes students in additional information put in links to blogs and websites, and just a word of caution that a lot of those are not live when the reader gets it on Slate, on the screen. My university, nothing was live. I couldn't even copy a website link or a blog post link. So if I didn't want to type in, 6 inches worth of the URL, I think at some schools I've heard that readers can access that information, but don't think of additional information as just a way to get someone to read your blog or your website. You've really got to use your words and describe what it is. What I really love too, Mark, is some kids get creative with additional information, and this always affects me when I see a student who, for example, is passionate about spoken word poetry or gives me a bilingual dive into something that's important. I read an application last winter. The fact that I remember it shows you that it was remarkable. That this was an American student, but who'd grown up in an international family, and she was translating recipes into Mandarin for a blog post that she did in China. And so what she chose to share was an excerpt from her whatever website blog post, but I got it in multiple languages, and she even put it into Spanish to kind of show that she was doing a multicultural outreach. And it was brilliant, not because I understood the Mandarin, but because it showed just her way of thinking and her sense of adventure linguistically, and the joy that she brought to this creative enterprise. That she could have put 180 characters on her activity list, but there was something about this that spoke to this young woman's character and her effect on people around her that really brought her to life. I mean, I thought it was wonderful. I also read some odd but interesting resumes in additional information. And additional information isn't a place to put just a regular old boilerplate resume. Some colleges invite that as an upload, or even after you apply, you can put stuff in your portal account. But this student wanted to write a resume about being a naturalist. She was a student of nature. And she had written about that. She wants to study environmental science, but she also wanted to share the everyday joy that she finds in chronicling the natural world around her. So I would say it was a resume, but almost more of a journal entry. And it was very effective. And it, in a way, validated an unusual use of time and passion that, there were no awards, there were no clubs, that there was only this commitments she had made to seeing the world around her and better understanding the flora and the fauna. So that was, I thought that was brilliant. It touched me deeply, as did the spoken word poetry, which also opened up a student's kind of inner landscape to me as a reader and brought them to life. So it can be cut and dried information, don't get me wrong, but it can also walk on the wild side a little bit. It's a place where you can take some risks that you may not feel you can take elsewhere in the application.
That's exactly what I was hoping for. So I really appreciate that. And I love those creative examples, which is awesome. So we'll turn our time and attention now to admissions vernacular, and the word is terminal degree. You'll oftentimes hear that used in academia and different places, and the terminal degree just refers to the highest academic degree that can be awarded in any particular field. But the interest, and some of you may think, okay, PhD. Well, no, because it varies greatly by discipline. So for example, there is the PhD, of course, Doctor of Philosophy. There's ED, Doctor of Education, MD, Doctor of Medicine, Doctor of Dental Surgery, DDS. There's the Doctor of Dental Medicine, DDM. There's the Doctor of Veterinary Medicine, DVM. Juris Doctor, JD, and then there's some masters that are terminal degrees: Masters of Fine Arts, MFA, Masters of Architecture, MArch. So that when you hear that term, it's just the highest possible degree, and a lot of times you'll hear it in the context of 95% of our professors have the terminal degree, meaning they have the highest possible degree that you could get in their various field. And so terminal degree is our admissions vernacular. And our big number for the day is taken right from the article we're going to transition to, which says that 25-year-olds fell by 1/4 or 2 million students going to college. So from 2011 to 2021, over that 10-year period, there were 8 million enrolled students that were 25 or older in college, most part-time, in 2011. And that number is now down to 6 million. So a drop of 2 million in a 10-year period. And that's our big number of the day. And that's also a good segue into our article. So,
and now it's time for Hot Topics in the News.
A little background on this article. It came, friend of the show, Rick Clark, had posted something on social media that said, please read this article. And so when Rick tells me to please read an article, I'm going to read it. And so I clicked over, and it's by Robert Kelchen. It appeared on my brother's birthday, June 14th, 2023. So pretty hot off the press. And the title is The Haves and the Have-Nots of Higher Ed. And then the subtitle really is Higher Ed is Increasingly Becoming Unequal. And it appeared in the Chronicle of Higher Education. Let me say something before I dive into this. Sometimes we talk about a novel topic we haven't talked about on this podcast. This is not necessarily that topic. Other times things are so important. Just to mention half dozen or so off the top of my head, we're going to come back to the whole test optional movement, of course, because it's a major movement in college admissions. We're going to talk about the new SAT, digital SAT. We're going to talk about FAFSA simplification. We're going to talk about, affirmative action. And we are going to talk about the enrollment cliff and the gap between the haves and the have-nots and higher ed. Those are just a half dozen. And the cost of college, another one, the rising cost of college. Those are about a half dozen topics we're just going to keep returning to because of their importance. And this is one of those. So this is not necessarily a brand new topic for us, but it does come at it in a little bit of a unique way with some good examples. So the article starts out talking about the fact that the demographic cliff, or oftentimes called the enrollment cliff, a sharp decline in the number of high schools, it's been around for years. It's already underway, especially in the Northeast and the Midwest. But in the past, higher ed has been able to blunt these various demographic cliffs because this isn't the first demographic cliffs. They've come around several times. Susan, you said you went through one in your time at Bates. I know there was a drop off in number of kids going to college. sometime around the time you were doing college admissions.
It was the 1980s, because it was the baby boom.
Yeah,
had finished college, but they were not. They were just starting to produce children, which then created the groundswell. Then about 15 years later, but it was that predicted sudden drop off in the 80s and into the 90s that was just devastating for higher ed, particularly in the industrialized states. The northern part of the United States, New England, because it was matched by a lot of the industries pulling up and moving away from hydropower as a source of information, moving south to tap other energy markets. And there was a big population decline and then a recession because of the population of people who had, been supporting their families in those industries often were without any way to replace their jobs. And they too left those industrialized states. So in the 80s, actually, that 10-year period, in the state of Massachusetts alone, the high school graduating population was cut in half.
Wow.
So the school districts started merging in anticipation of needing to close schools, which they did. The state of Massachusetts was a textbook place. Schools regionalized. They eliminated small high schools. It was devastating. And colleges whose primary markets were high school graduates in those industrialized states, i.e. New England, New York, had to seek other markets. And that was when schools started saying, well, when I got to Bates, the word was we need to develop not just secondary markets, but tertiary markets. So off we went.
Yeah, and that's really helpful background, because the point is this isn't the first time there's been a demographic cliff, but the article points out that this one may be a little different because some of the tools that have been used in the past are not necessarily as easily accessible. Tools is probably not the best word. Some of the pipelines to students.
Right.
So one of the things the article says is in the past, one thing that schools did was reach out to the older population. And then that's when that big number came in. Well, that's pretty tough when it's down 2 million students in the last 10 years. And overall, the number of students going to college has fallen from 69% in 2018 to 62% in 2021. In fact, when you look at numbers, and this is according to National Student Clearinghouse, which is reliable data, the only two areas showing a surge in students right now is the for-profit sector and dual enrollment students, both high school and community college. And then it makes a really interesting point that I don't think we've shared before in the podcast. It says our sector is counter-cyclical. And you're like, what are you talking about? So here's what they mean by that. Enrollment in college tends to actually increase during recessions, and it decreases during strong economies. And one of the reasons for that is because students have access to full-time jobs with better pay. So an unexpectedly strong economy following the pandemic is one of the things, according to this article, that's really contributed to the enrollment decline. And we've talked about that now. And people can go and get a $22 an hour job right out of high school, maybe making more than your father. That's been particularly attractive to young men, especially first-gen families. Couple that with the growing skepticism of college. We talked about that a lot. The partisan divide, we've talked about that before, contributing to the increase in college. Then it says throw in high inflation and the dissipation of pandemic support funds. It's not exactly the rosiest time for colleges right now. And then it goes on to say there are two groups, however, that are thriving. One is maybe a few dozen highly rejected private colleges with enormous endowments. They're in a stronger position than ever. And the other group is flagship universities, many of which are, and I like this term, vacuuming up students that the regional university and the community colleges are struggling to enroll. And then it gives an example because the person who wrote this is actually at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, where I just came back from, the flagship. And he said, we're bursting at the seams to the point where we had to rent a Holiday Inn to house students. He says, our enrollment's up 6.6% last year, and it's up 17% since 2018. And of course, we're having Alfonso, the VP of Enrollment, come on to talk about what they did to do that. So kind of will sync kind of nicely with this conversation. But he says, meanwhile, look at the rest of the state. The University of Tennessee's campuses, Chattanooga and Martin, they're down in their enrollment since 2018, and they're down about 2 to 3%. The community colleges are down 20%. And then he talks about how this leads to inevitable inequities. So he uses an example. He says there was conversation within the University of Tennessee system about what is going to be the price increase. Of course, these things are not made at the school level, made way above that level. And the state's Higher Education Commission limited them to a 3% jump in tuition. Well, UTK, UT Knox, the flagship, they wanted a 1.8% increase for facilities and transportation. Well, the other system campuses, they said, no, please, we need the full 3%. And then UTC, University of Tennessee, Chattanooga, their explanation for the spike is telling. Here's a quote. Projected growth from state appropriations and other funding sources will not provide sufficient funding to respond to the rise in inflation and to fund the salary pool. Meanwhile, at Knoxville, they've been able to, completely not have that concern at all without having to have that 3% increase. And then he goes on to say, well, if you think this is just a Tennessee thing, I'll read what it says here. It says, there are plenty of other states where the flagship public university is doing extremely well while other institutions are suffering. In Michigan, using data between 2018 and 2022, total enrollment is up 9.7% in Ann Arbor, down 22% at Michigan Flint, and down 12.1% at Wayne State. These are all regional publics in the state of Michigan. And let's look at Pennsylvania. It's up 4.2% at Penn State's main flagship campus, University Park. It's down 17.4% at the regional campuses. In Illinois, it's up 14.5% at UIUC, flagship Urbana-Champaign, down 8.2% at University of Illinois Springfield, and down 10.1% at Western Illinois. Let's look at Louisiana, up 14.7% at LSU and Baton Rouge, the flagship, down 23.5% at Northwestern State, and down 11.6% at the University of Louisiana. And then it goes on to say, okay, I know the similarity there. Those are all public schools. It says, guess what? It's not just regional publics that are struggling. Let's look at private schools. And I've mentioned this on the podcast a couple times, how DePaul was down. And I said 52.5 million budget deficit. I used that as a big number a couple of weeks ago. Actually, was off 4 million. It's 56.5 million is the budget deficit at DePaul, down 6.8%. And we could go on and on and on with plenty of other examples of schools. And then the article, goes on to say, well, what does the future look like? Well, it says, where are these additional students going to come from? It says, historically, community colleges have been a source. Regional universities online have accommodated the bulk of recession-induced boosts in enrollment, in some cases international students. But given the current trend, these sectors may not benefit as much as they have in the past. And they said, well, the rest of the article looks at some possible solutions and some things that maybe can be done. But it's not necessarily super optimistic that all of them will work. It says one thing that could happen is that flagships could do what Alabama's done. A lot of people wonder, well, with all of Alabama's football success, why is it still have a pretty high acceptance rate? That's because University of Alabama Tuscaloosa enrolls more than 10,000 more undergraduates now than they did 10 years ago. So one possible solution is to have flagships expand if they're in demand and to get bigger. Another it talks about is to build relationships in the community. And it talks about local support has always been the hallmark of community colleges ever since their creation. And surveys show that they're viewed favorably across the political spectrum, more so than other schools. So can you leverage your relationships within the community? And then the last thing it talks about is basically lobbying, invest in public relations. It says regional publics lobbying may be beneficial as anything to try to get higher ed funding formulas to be more conducive, basically lobbying so that the schools can get more money and have more of an operating the budget to work with. So that's kind of the essence of the article. It talks about the haves versus the have-nots. While this might be a uniquely challenging time, unlike some of the other demographic cliffs, and it just says, buyer beware. So, Susan, you've read the article. Anything you want to add?
I think what's different about this period of time is that we're seeing so many college closures, and that was rare, in the past enrollment cliffs that we've seen, Mark. And I think this time colleges are just realizing that there's no end in sight in terms of enrollment bouncing back. They've kind of been beaten by the market, and they've lost so much ground over a period of time, while other schools around them, be it the flagship publics or the more well-endowed privates, that they're just not going to have a place. Many of them over the last 20 years have tapped that online market. Certainly here in the Philadelphia area, we saw colleges just double down on their online divisions. It was really astounding how they came up. I think some of them are just run out of options. I mean, you probably don't even know this, but yesterday Cabrini College announced its closure.
Really? I did not know
that. Right here.
Funny, I went to a session that they did at NACAC this and I remember actually having a conversation with you afterward. I'm like, man, they're really struggling, because they were talking about ideas to help enrollment and things that you can do. And one of their ideas was, when a tour guide gets really good feedback from somebody, give them a $5 Starbucks card. And I said, I don't know if you remember me reaching out to
yes.
them, like, $5? They're really hurting over there. So it doesn't come as a cup
of water for that much.
Yeah. So I knew they were really struggling. That's too bad.
Well, I was on their campus last summer for a professional association meeting, and they're on the main line. They're in a very pricey, beautiful area surrounded by affluent communities, and their campus had so much deferred maintenance that anybody walking around would be worried about it. I mean, it was just it was very worrisome. The good news for Cabrini, if there is good news, is that Villanova University is buying the campus. So I assume that will go to addressing their debts. And the president of Villanova was on TV last night, and he's like, I don't know what we're going to do with it. But I think, within Catholic higher education, there's probably a sense of morality there, where the well-resourced have to help out the folks in trouble. So
I'm not surprised, Susan. I mean, they were really honest with the challenge they were having, and this was just
interesting.
Half a year ago. One thing they said is, everybody talks about Boston and how schools are on top of each other. They said, we have 13 Catholic schools within, and they gave the radius. It wasn't very big, but basically in the Philly area. And then they said, you know what? It's really almost impossible for us to beat Villanova for a kid and to beat St. Joseph's for a kid. It's just really not going to, so they were just talking about how they have to get creative because of the competition. And I know we've certainly seen it with women's colleges, with art schools. Those schools we're seeing a lot of mergers there.
Yeah, I think colleges that don't have a strong brand, a strong identity, even, and I know you often refer to the two kiss of death features as not a strong brand and a bad location.
Yeah, and endowment. I took that from Scott Jasic and the work they've done at Higher Ed. They said the three things.
That's the third one, right?
Yeah, they said if you don't have strong brand or endowment or location, you're toast. And if you only have one of those three, you may survive, but it's going to be tough. And if you have two, much better. Right. If you have all three, I mean, look at Williams. Williams is doing fine. They've got a very remote location, but they've got the brand and they've got the endowment.
That's right.
So they can thrive. And one reason why I like to come back to this topic periodically, Susan, is, and I know you see this too, because we always work with students. There is this perception out there, and it's with parents, that why is college so hard to get into these days? And that's because it's the 24, or maybe even if you want to say 36, highly selective or highly rejective, pick your term, private schools, and it's the flagships that gobble up all the ink. I'm going to be interviewing Ron Lieber. We're doing it on August 1st. I'm sure it'll probably air a couple months after that. He wrote the book, The Price You Pay for College. But I heard him challenged once, and I love his transparency. He said, "Why are you writing about Harvard all the time in the New York Times? It's ridiculous." And he said, he basically said, we have to write things that people will click. 30% of our audience either thinks their kid can go to Harvard or they're Harvard curious, And I say all that because the downside of that is it presents a warped view of higher ed.
Yes,
you're reading all these articles on how hard it is to get in, and it doesn't accurately convey how small a percentage of the overall schools in the higher ed landscape that actually applies to. And I feel like that message is almost ubiquitous, because where do people get their news? They read things like the Times and the Post, and hey, there's a business aspect of that. They got to have a good title. You have a title, Harvard soars in lowest admission rate ever, people click it. You have an article on Cabrini, maybe not so much.
Right.
You write on Stanford and it soars. You write on Samford in Alabama, nobody clicks it. So they deal with that reality, and then that creates a skewed view in the mind of the public. And sometimes we'll see it in the counseling room where someone will say something like, I'll speak for a parent, like, my student just hasn't done that well. Like, they just are not excelling in school. They have maybe they have 4 B- and a C+. And the parent literally thinks, I don't think they're going to be able to get in college. Well, you and I know there's literally hundreds of schools.
And wonderful schools.
Yes, that would love to have that student. And so to me, that's why it's important that we do come back to this topic periodically, to balance all the noise that's out there that is almost impossible to get into college these days.
That's right.
Now, somebody once said that, the reason why it's hard to get in is because the schools people want to get into are hard to get in. It's like, the dog chasing the tail. But if people can just take a broader view and a broader perspective of the excellent schools that are out there. I mean, one of the favorite things that I'll always remember from my interview with Antonoff, my interview with Stephen Antonoff. And I said, what have you learned in multiple decades of doing this work? And he said, well, there was a time when I thought there were probably a couple dozen first choice schools.
Ooh.
And now I realize there are literally hundreds. There's hundreds of schools that for the right kid are a first choice option, and that's part of the message that we want to get out here. Absolutely. In the podcast. And so, we'll talk about some of those hot articles because, people are interested in that, and you guys send them in, about the increasing selectivity. We'll talk about that, but it's important that we balance that with the broader picture, which is the overwhelming number of schools would just like a good kid who's average, and they'll be very happy with that. And like you said, not just in great schools too.
I know. And average is what, that
I was just talking GPA. Just in terms of GPA.
No, I know. Yeah. But I often think that, there are so many well-prepared students out there. Maybe they haven't peaked yet.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't even like to call them late bloomers because I think they're blooming right on time. They just need to continue to be planted in fertile ground so that they continue to develop and find it is what they're interested in studying and do that. And we tend to think of our, the high school population across the country is segmented into, superlative, above average, and, mediocre and, abject failures. And it's just a terrible waste of human resources as we look at the young people in the country. And I think the fault with the college guidance community is that we as a group don't really know what's out there in terms of, I talked to a student the other day who said, well, he really wanted to go to Williams or Dartmouth, but he'd never get in. And I said, well, aren't you lucky? Because, just to the west is St. Lawrence University, which happens to be very much on par with Dartmouth and Williams in terms of the type of campus and the excellent faculty and access to skiing and outdoors activities. And, the mom on the Zoom call looked at me and said, really? And it was like a lot of these, whether they're private or public, they're a little more regional. They don't quite have the national cachet, but they have developed outstanding programs, and they haven't tried to be all things to all people. They've had good leadership, and a lot of them have capitalized on the strengths of their regions and on their very good academic programs that they do very well and that are marketable.
I find that, as a person, I can say that too. And if I can back it up with data,
yep,
they are exuberant. And then there's another one. It was really about the brand. And so that would, they just completely categorically reject that because it was, it's about the brand. And if it's about the brand, then I find that doesn't go as well. And everybody's different.
Yeah, but then where are those people going to get into college? Is, when I talk to families like that, I sympathize because empathy is a very important counseling quality, as we know. And I say, well, let's talk about how you would like to build your college list then. What's your, your plan B? And it's actually, you and I know it's probably more like a plan C.
Sure.
Because you have to start helping families understand that there are terrific, and what's funny is because if we were in the Albany area or Rochester or Buffalo, the St. Lawrence University of the world has an incredibly strong brand. It's viewed as maybe the top liberal arts college option in upstate New York, right? But you get down to, New York City or, Philly or Boston. And so it is kind of it's like, well, do the parents know alumni?
That you're bringing up something that's really important, Susan. I had a conversation recently, a podcast listener who made the comment that it'd be better to go to UK, Kansas, Kansas University, than to go to Harvard if you're going to be in Kansas. Like, the network's incredible.
Penn State's another great example. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's something that we've actually added a question to our questionnaire. What are 3 or 4 places that you think you may live? Now, nobody knows that, but I'm actually thinking this way. And because if you're going to live in these places, the name recognition is incredible for certain schools, and it's something that I think people don't think about.
Right.
And that really does bode well for a lot of schools, whether it's less well-known nationally public schools or flagships, especially. They have huge networks and big alumni, and pretty much any flagship, doesn't matter what it is. Nebraska, you go to Nebraska.
Something that I've noticed, Mark, too, that kind of represents this trend that you and I just were talking about are the parents that are saying they'll pay full price, pay a lot for either that, private college with a strong brand, one of those highly rejectives perhaps, or for a flagship public that carries so much name recognition in their region of the country, wherever that is. And if that doesn't work out, then they're going to kind of go to a much less expensive option, meaning they won't go down a couple of notches in either of those categories, but still have to pay as much.
I get that all the time.
I
get people say, for the right school,
I'll pay. Yeah,
I'll pay full, but if it's not, I'm not paying the same. And part of me understands that. And the part that's really hard having a name recognition conversation and what role prestige plays is that I think it's unfair to say it's not a benefit at all.
Oh, of course.
And if you try to say that, people won't believe you anyway, especially if they've gone to a selective school, because they'll say, you know what, I've personally experienced. I just had somebody say the other day, I've worked for Apple, I've worked for the leading software companies, and I've seen the difference that going to certain schools makes in terms of who gets interviews. And so it's so hard to capture the nuance. Like, I think it's overrated in general because it's everything to people, and they don't realize things like just how good your communication skills are and things like that are going to carry more weight in the long run, or your work ethic, or, your integrity, like all these things from a career standpoint. But if you come off like you're saying it's a complete non-factor, it doesn't ring true to people's personal experience. And so it's hard to capture that nuance correctly. And so I understand when people say, look, if I'm buying a car with all the bells and the whistles, I expect to pay more than if I'm giving up some features that I like. And I don't know if you remember this, Susan. You said one thing once, and we were just having a casual conversation. And it was one of the more profound things that you've ever said.
My goodness.
Yeah. And I never even told you that I thought it was profound, because I walked away. And it wasn't even that long ago. It was since you've been on the podcast. It wasn't back in our Westtown days, but we were just talking off the air. And yeah, you're like, what is this? What did I say? And the statement that you said was, every one of us has a little bit of snob in us. Do you remember saying that now?
Yes, I do.
And I actually thought that was so profound to just kind of own that. And rather than always fight it and ego maniacal person and be self-righteous and sanctimonious. Like, let's just own it. Like,
right.
Every other like, think of all the things. How many people would be doctors if people thought they were a janitor? But they got to be a doctor, but people thought they were a janitor, right? Like a lot of things people do, part of what they do is, and here's another thing that's helped me reframe that in my own mind. Because I used to be kind of sanctimonious in my own mind a little bit, but prestige is in some ways an ugly word. Really, a lot of times what people want is respect.
Mm-hmm.
Because I see it with peers, right? Like, why is it so important to peers, especially if they're at a highly competitive suburban school or a highly selective public? Why is it so important that peers go to someplace with some name recognition? Well, you know what it is? They want the respect of their other peers. And if that's how the framework through which their peers are looking at things, and you know what? That's a very human emotion. Like, we all want respect. We want respect in our job. We want respect. And so I think it's let me come off my hobby horse a little bit. But your statement, we all have a little snob in us, and owning that, I think has also helped me not be so smug my own stuff. Does that make sense? So it's just hard because, I think we both think that people overrate it. And I do worry about people who think that because I went to XYZ school, then the Red Sea's going to part. And then someday they're going to get out there and say, hey, how's that guy my boss? When they went to this school, and so I worry about that. But I also, I think, would be remiss to not say that part of what's a complicating factor is people have experienced some benefits. Either if they went to a prestigious school, they've experienced the benefits of it. I'll give you a case in point. My previous job at KIPP, the guy who hired my boss, he specifically told me he was impressed with the person we went to because she graduated from Vanderbilt's Peabody School. And he's like, I know how hard that is to get in. And so that says something to me about her.
Okay.
Now, she turned out to be a great boss, and it was a great hire, and she was amazing. But that was a case where he was looking at Vanderbilt Peabody. He wouldn't have reacted the same way to Fort Valley State. It was a regional school. And so I think sometimes when we have this conversation, I think it's important to just be honest that does happen out there and not to just completely dismiss it. And therefore, now, do I think people in general put more value on it than they should? Yes. Do I think it matters more in certain professions than others? I think there's a lot of nuance. And do I definitely feel this thing about regional cachet and regional name recognition and regional prestige is hugely overlooked. But I don't know. Those are just my thoughts on adding a bit.
No, I hear you on that, Mark. I think that's very, very perceptive. And it's very different. And, as college counselors, we just need to try and understand where our families are coming from and what their worldview is when it comes to this, and understand that that's honorable, what it means for them. I think we're the voice of reason. I prefer not to think of myself as a dream killer, but more as, the voice of reason to help frame this process and have introduce a paradigm that will have better outcomes. But respect for our families and where they're coming from and how they see themselves in the world is fundamental, absolutely, to being helpful.
Well, there's another thing I think that drives us a lot too, which is we want kids to have healthy self-esteem.
Absolutely.
And when we see kids that have sometimes erected, or parents, a mindset, like I literally did a session this week with someone whose parent said to me, my kid says that if he doesn't get in an Ivy League school, he's a loser.
Oh boy.
Like I said, do you realize 1 out of 200 kids go to the Ivy League? Like when we see people put this kinds of pressure on themselves, especially when we know that you can have ridiculous amounts of success not doing that, that's a false paradigm. And so so a lot of times we are motivated, I think, by we want to see kids feel good about themselves, have healthy self-esteem. But we're not just snake oil salesperson. We are selling them truth.
Yes.
We are selling them truth to say, you don't have to do that to do incredibly well from a career standpoint. But I do think a lot of times that's part of our motivation also is we want kids to feel really, really good, and they should feel good. And when you've erected a standard that's almost like, well, if I don't win the gold medal at the Olympics,
yes,
I'm a loser. We're going to push back on that and say, you're incredible at what you did. Look at your talents, and you're sitting here seeing the glass half empty. So I think a lot of times that's also what drives both of us to try to get people to redefine success.
Absolutely.
And we feel so passionately about it because we also know that it's true from an outcome standpoint, right? We're not just trying to make people feel good because we want them to feel good. Like the sky's the limit for you. If you go to a non-select, school, the sky's the limit for you. And that actually really is true. And so anyway, I think we've probably talked this up in circles enough, but it's a good conversation.
Oh, I enjoyed it. And I think there's a lot of wisdom in there.
So listeners, these are the kinds of conversations Susan and I have been having for over 20 years. I would be in her office so many times, or we'd have dinner together, because at boarding school, you eat your meals there.
That's right.
And we would just go for hours and the time would fly by. And so I feel like we get to do that again, and we just have people just eavesdropping in on our conversations now.
Which is wonderful. I'm happy to have them here listening.
Thanks, Susan. We'll see you.
Bye-bye.
And now it's time for a question from one of our listeners.
Many of you heard our interview, or Lisa's interview with Elliot Felix, on how to get the most out of college. And Elliot has graciously donated some books to us. And we are going to send a copy of his book to any person who sends in a Speakpipe question that we put on the air. And so Ellie's going to be the first winner.
Yay!
And she's going to get a copy of the book. And the book really does have some really good content. It really makes you think through how to do college, something we don't think about that much. And so send in the Speakpipe questions. You might also get help with going through college by getting a copy of the book. And you just go to speakpipe.com/YCBK. But Ellie, question 48, first award winner. Thank you.
Hi, this is Ellie from New York. My question is, if an academically strong student plans to take a gap year, is it better to still apply to colleges during their senior year and then defer the acceptance? Or is it preferable for them to wait until the fall or regular decision time during their gap year? I'm sure you're going to say it depends, but I'd love to hear your take on the situations in which it's preferable to do one over the other. Thank you.
All right. So Ellie wants to know, it's a great question. We've actually answered this on the podcast, but when you're in your 6th year, like some stuff's going to come up again, right? It's been a few years. And the whole question is when to take the gap year. Do you apply, get in, then defer, or do you not even apply to college, take the gap year, and then apply? So the answer is that it's usually in most instances going to be better to apply as a senior, get admitted, and then request the gap. And there are a few reasons for that. One of them is think about what's involved in getting into a school. You need transcripts, a counselor rec, teacher recs. Like when that graduating class has gone on, they've moved on and they're thinking about the voluminous workload in front of them.
Right.
So that can be logistically difficult to get that stuff, just to get it. And then teachers' memories of you may be a little hazy. Counselors, not as much as before. You might not necessarily get as good a rec, and it can be just difficult even getting it. So that's one of the main reasons why it's better to just secure your spot. And then, of course, applying for gap's not guaranteed, but most of the time it will be granted just because as long as you have a reason that schools feel will strengthen you as a person and you'll come back more self-aware or more in tune with what you're interested in. They're getting a more mature person, and so they generally like that. Of course, they can't have everybody gapping, so that happened in some schools during the pandemic, and they had to put caps on it. But generally, as long as you have a good reason, most schools, and I do have to speak this way because there are exceptions, will approve it. Now, there are a couple exceptions I can think of when it may not be good. It might be good to take the other way. One would be if you absolutely have no idea at all where to apply to college. Because one thing that colleges won't go for is you get in, you request a gap, they hold the spot for you. There's usually language that says you can't then go apply outside to other places. So, you'll forfeit your spot. So if you have no idea where you're applying to college, that could be one reason to potentially look at things differently. The other would be the 2-year gap. And that's, I don't know if you even call that a gap. That's more like delaying college. Because sometimes people can have such a transformational experience then that they look sometimes significantly stronger as an applicant. The one of the other problems, I never mentioned this, but think about the timing of if you delay. So now you've delayed, and now you're in the fall. Let's say you're trying to make early action deadlines of November 1st often. You usually haven't had that much of some kind of experience in such a short period of time to somehow make yourself a better candidate.
Right.
So that's sometimes what people think, well, I'll take this gap, I'll do this, and then I'm look really, really strong and I'm getting on this. Well, you really haven't had a lot of time to do that. And your transcript is still ultimately the biggest factor. So, and another thing to keep in mind is sometimes when people delay, they don't ever actually end up even applying as well. They just sort of get off of that mindset and, depending on what they do. So those are my thoughts. I feel pretty strongly about it. I don't know really anyone that I know that would say in most instances you're better off not applying. I think I'm giving pretty conventional wisdom in the profession.
Right.
You have any thoughts, Lisa?
No, I think that from a logistical sense, it's a lot easier to apply while you're still in high school and you have all those resources. I guess, I'm thinking though of people whose lives, they experience a loss or, something happens to them and they need to take some time off. What would you recommend those students do in terms of trying to apply later on? I mean, can they still go back to their high schools? How does that work?
Mm-hmm. So tell me when the person has the loss. Is this like someone in their senior year They're going
right,
through, they're having their
say,
loss, and they're like, I just
yeah,
can't go through this college thing right now.
right. They're just, it's not, for whatever reason, it's not emotionally or physically possible at that point, or they're ill. Like it's not possible for them to put in an application.
Yeah. Yeah. So in that case, I would be in touch with my school counselor and even your teachers, and let them know what your plans are. I would try to secure recommendation commitments ahead of time. And, depending on what their mental state is, I might be asking too much, you know what I mean? If they lost a parent or something like that. So what I'm asking might be difficult to do. But, getting the commitments from teachers and counselors and having some communication with them would be the best way to do it if you just can't, because that's the part that's really difficult. And keep in mind, not every school needs all these recommendations. It's selective schools that require 2 teacher recs. There's a lot of schools that don't have any. But that would be the best way to do that, because that's a lot of times the place where things bottleneck. And then a lot of times when we talk about gap, we always kind of assume a gap year. A lot of times it's a gap semester, and I was talking with a family recently about this. Like, I brought up the gap semester concept, and then they said, well, isn't going to be incredibly awkward coming in like in January if everybody else came in August or whatever. And that really depends on the school. So sometimes really small schools, there may be a very small number of people transitioning, in the middle of the year. But sometimes with bigger schools, and sometimes even smaller schools, but sometimes schools have really, really good orientations and bonding, and they're aware of that transition being difficult, and they go to great lengths to create a bond and to help people with that. And so that's always something to think about as well, is, are you going to do a gap semester, or are you going to do a gap year? But yeah, to answer your question, Lisa, the key thing there would be to maintain communication with the school, and that's going to make for much easier. It's not easy when people have moved on, and like, schools like, I barely can handle the load in front of me. Now some of the people are coming back, and I don't hardly even remember you. So that their knowledge of you, keeping some communication with them, would be the important thing there.
Okay, great.
Awesome. Hopefully that was helpful, Ellie. Thank you guys for everybody. And Ellie, you get to be our first winner of our Speakpipe book giveaway. Bring them on, everybody. We love questions. So now we'll incentivize you. And I'll tell you, I'll be really honest with you guys. I'll be really transparent. I'm having some more conversations with some other people about getting some more books as well, because once Elliott's book supply runs out, I'd like to be able to continue offering this as an ongoing Speakpipe feature. So we'll see how successful I am. All right. Take care. See you next week, Lisa.
And now this week's interview with a special guest.
Friends, if you missed last week's interview with Akil Bello, I urge you to go back and listen to part 1. But today in part 2, Akil will share what is arguably his biggest beef with how test scores are used. He shares where he sees test optional movement going. He talks about the College Board's validity studies. He answers the question, is it hypocritical for him to be so critical of the SAT and to make his money as an SAT tutor? Akil answers the question, is it easier to improve your ACT score or your SAT score? He also answers the question, is it easier to get a perfect score on the ACT or the SAT? And then Akil shares whether he thinks the ACT or the SAT is the better test for a student who is strong in math. Listen and enjoy.
Back to the point you made about GPA, right? The test being predictive is a little bit of a bizarre thing to me. What I've always seen is, I actually think your 3.2 to 3.4 is generous, right? I've actually done this a few times on Twitter. I've tried to get a sense of, what is a meaningful distinction in GPA? Do I really give a damn if a kid gets a 3.3 instead of a 3.4? Is that actually meaningful? Right now, the thing that doesn't get disaggregated in these conversations is generally higher test scores come from wealthier families. So the kid with a 3.4, right, probably had the wherewithal to, or the ability to hire a tutor, didn't have to work a full-time job while in school. So of course, all of the demographic things suggest they're going to get higher GPAs simply because of the environment around being in school, right? And that's never disaggregated in these conversations. So that strikes me as bizarre. If we take it away from even, the MIT, which is a really small, it's the Hogwarts of colleges, right? It's a small, special, we're doing our own little magical thing place. Fine. Right? Like, that's lovely. If we look at Purdue, which is sort of more representative,
I was going to ask you, what do you think of Purdue
right?
and Georgetown?
Purdue released some research, right? Purdue's research basically says less than 1,000. The graduation rates for students scoring less than 1,100 on the SAT is 53%. Graduation rate for students scoring 1,400 to 1,500 is much better at 59%. Like that's what that's what we supported a $2 billion industry for. So Purdue can predict their graduation rate better by 6 percentage points. And graduation rate is insane, right? Because like that presumes this test you took in 11th grade affects your graduation 7 years later, and nothing else matters.
Well, I think that nothing else matters is a major point, because you're talking about just taking kids coming from completely a different culture and putting them into West Lafayette, there's a good chance that might impact graduation rate, just like an American kid trying to go overseas and go to study in China or something. And I do find it interesting how, UIUC, Andy Borst has come out and said, we will indefinitely be test optional. And this is slightly different topic, but it still correlates. All of our research indicates that we can admit a test optional kid who can do just as well, graduate at the same rate, have the same GPA, by just sharpening and honing our admission skills.
And even if we say, even if I just accept the rates that they currently have, right? I just find that the difference between a 3.2 and a 3.3 GPA is immaterial. Why do we support a $2 billion test prep industry, a testing industry, and another $2 billion test prep industry in order for colleges to predict their graduation rate by 5 percentage points? That seems insane. As a person who cares about society, I don't want that. Right? That just seems a horrible misuse of time, of resources.
Well, especially when you think about if you're going to sort of have those blinders on and see the world through that prism, what are all the other things that other student could be bringing to your community that just get completely overlooked because you're seeing things through the prism of scores?
Right. And if we broke down the Purdue data further, right, they break it actually into score bands. Below 1,100, 52% graduation rate, 11 to 12, 57, 12 to 13, 57, 13 to 14, 56.9. So there's actually no real, so below 1,100, there's a 5 percentage point drop, right? From 1,100 to 1,500 is almost essentially the same graduation rate. And then there's a 7-point jump from 15 above. It's the test is telling you almost nothing, and nothing that you couldn't find out elsewhere. And it's a noisy tool, right? There's more noise than signal in all of that, right? And so I think places like Georgetown, everybody and their mama knew Georgetown was going back to requiring scores.
Sure.
Right? Everybody knows Charlie Deacon loves the SAT with the passion we all want our significant others to love us with.
That's probably not an exaggeration. I mean, I know how even the subject test, boy, did they go fighting and screaming before they dropped the subject test.
Did they ever drop the subject test, or was the subject test stopped being offered as a product?
And they were really stopped being. Yeah.
Right. We know Charlie Deacon, as long as he runs that shop, he wants every test in creation. He's like, send not only your super square, but every SAT you've ever taken in your entire life.
I know.
It's a
bit of an outlier over there.
Right. It's not a meaningful example of somebody who's looking at tests from a research perspective, right? He's looking at tests from I like them, therefore I want them, which I don't dispute. I have a bigger problem with all of the societal information that's put out there that tells students with lower test scores that they're not college ready, right? With all of the colleges and all of the high schools that are using phrases like college ready, career ready, and tying that to test scores, right? What if we just said test ready? Fine, you're not good at it. No one really gets mad when you say you're a good athlete, but you suck at baseball. Oh, cool. Like, okay, fine. I didn't like baseball anyway. I played golf once, right? And I took my best baseball swing and hit the ball about 12 feet. But I find golf incredibly boring. I never tried it again. If you told me I was a bad golfer, I would say yes and move on with my life. You tell me I'm a bad athlete, that means something different. And we've been doing that with test scores for far too long. We've been using test scores and telling people they're bad students. They're not college ready. They're not career ready. These are problems.
Appreciate that you're coming and shooting straight here, Akil. This is good. This is good. So let's let you put your crystal ball hat on. 5 years from now, do you think more schools will be requiring scores? Do you think more schools will go to test blind, test free, score free, use whatever term you prefer? Do you think it'll kind of stay about status quo? Where do you see this thing moving?
I think there'll be a little bit of movement. I think there'll be more shifting back and forth. One school requiring for a bit, another school not, one school changing a policy. I think we're probably fairly well established. I think that we're going to be where we are right now as far as like the general percentages go. Maybe it'll go from 81% of schools being test optional to 72, not 72. I don't think it'll drop 10 percentage points, right? But I think it might drop 5 or 6, might go up a little bit, but it's not going to shift very much as far as I can tell, not unless something significant happens.
I would agree with that because a few things are happening now. One, schools are getting more applications, and we know how much they treasure more applications. They're also getting more applications from some typical demographics that are valuable that they have had a really hard time attracting applications from. And then on top of that, their competitors are test optional, and they don't want to have to, unilaterally disarm when they're competitors. So I think for all of those reasons. And then another reason is I think increasingly schools are getting more comfortable reading files in a test optional environment. I hear over and over from admission officers that, like, wow, we really don't need these things, like, to make decisions. Like, we really don't. We have enough in the file that we can make great. So there's a comfort level there. Some schools are doing their own internal, validation studies. Now that'll be the one thing. If some of those internal validation studies show whatever, lower grad rates, lower attrition, this, that, the other, then that might cause certain schools to go back and question.
And that's, I think for me, all those things are true. And I think all those things are important, right? Like, I can't ever see a world where USC, right, requires the test knowing all the UCs are test free.
Right.
Right. So I think that I think the validation studies that you find, like, because even if you look at the College Board validation studies, right, or validity studies, what they tend to say is small distinctions in GPA. They just released the digital SAT validity study, which makes me laugh a little bit. College Board threw out 39 scores, 200 scores? No, 39 scores of people who dropped 200 points paper test to digital test because they decided those people had low motivation. It's like, if your score dropped that much, you must have low motivation. You're out of our study, which was fascinating. So College Board to me does as much statistical juking as you can possibly do, right? But at the end of the day, their validity study said, I should have pulled it up, but I don't have it, but it was something like below a 900, right? In on the test was like a 3.3 GPA. Right? Like, it correlated with 3.3 GPA. To me, I keep saying, like, okay, great. Like, so what? Like, so you basically, like, guessing randomly on the SAT would get you about a 760. So this person did slightly better than guessing randomly. And they got above, or these people, right? They got above a 3.0 in their college career, in their first year of college. What is the test telling you then? Like, so we're quibbling between students doing well. Like, why is it meaningful to anyone if you graduate with a 3.3 or 3.6? Like, who should be looking at those numbers? And those are the questions that I have, right? It's like, fine, if we're going to do validity study, like, these need to be meaningful things. If you tell me a 3.3 means that student is not ready to go into a workplace and hold a job, then great. Then let's worry about the 3.3s. But to me, I don't think so.
So, Akil, I'm going to ask one of my tougher questions.
Mm-hmm.
You do test prep. You've done it before. You've done it for 30 years. You continue to do it. People can book with you right now.
Yes, they can.
So what do you say to the person? And I've heard this before. Akil's always out there railing against the SAT, but he makes his money as an SAT tutor. That's hypocritical.
Tell them mind your business. First and foremost, mind your business. Second, saying there should be a cancer analogy there. It's like saying an oncologist shouldn't treat cancer because he's trying to stop it. It's like, but also like to me, there's a distinction between. So I think there are two different things. Doing test prep, A, pays me well and it's easy for me. Why would I stop? Right? B, the tests still exist. So as long as the test exists, why would I not use my knowledge of the test to pay my bills? To make me more money than I do as an advocate for getting rid of the test. So, as I like to say, my part-time job as a test prep tutor makes more money than my full-time job working at Fairtest. Right? So, until the test goes away, I will continue to tutor it. But in the meantime, I will do all I can to make people recognize the limitations of these tests. In a perfect world, no one would ever pay me for test prep.
Let's take a break to learn about Mark's recommended resource for the week.
Friends, we have just an incredible group of listeners in our listening community. And one of our listeners actually serves as an attorney that a lot of Ivy League schools have hired to work with when it comes to this whole affirmative action case. And the listener reached out and shared an incredible video that was produced by the law firm that works with a lot of these Ivy League schools, giving them a lot of advice on what does this decision actually mean. And we got special permission to share it with you. So I don't want to mention listener by name because I never got permission, but just be grateful for them for sharing this because, you know, the decision is so confusing that it doesn't actually answer questions such as, can a school have scholarships designated for students of color? Or even more explicitly, Black or Latino or Native American or Native Hawaiian, Cambodian students. Can schools do that? What should schools be saying in their announcement of this decision? And can their announcements get them in trouble? Can schools have boxes and tabulate data on race and even collect it? Can they report out the racial diversity numbers at the end of the school year? Can schools have affinity groups and affinity programs for students of color? Can they do targeted recruitment to students of color? Or is all that stuff impermissible? Did the clause that got added or the caveat give schools free rein to do that? Or do they not really have that liberty? Those are the kind of things that get addressed. This is a law firm speaking to Ivy League universities, giving them advice on what this decision practically means for their everyday life moving forward. I think it's fantastic. I've listened to it twice. Dave absolutely loves it, and he devours everything on this topic. So I really hope you'll take time. It's about a 52-minute video, and it's a recommended resource for episode 343. And friends, in order to access this video, we'll put the link in the show notes. So just go to the show notes, and you'll see the video on affirmative action. Now I return to my interview with Akil Bello. Let's talk a little bit about score gains working with kids. Do you feel ACT versus SAT, do you think it completely depends on the person? Or do you think one test is easier to get score gains with the student?
No, I think it depends on the person. There are some things that are more straightforward about the ACT than the SAT. But the ACT is more, the SAT feels more like school. So I think the there's trade-offs. To me, there's essentially, my analogy has always been it's Coke and Pepsi, right? Like
sure.
I think Pepsi's nasty. I think Coke is delicious. Pepsi's some nasty crap. But I also realize
I might fight you on that one, even that I live in Atlanta, the town that Coke built.
Exactly. Like, you should know, Coke is elixir from the gods. Right? Whereas Pepsi, I don't know what heathen created that while trying to replicate Coke. Right? But in truth, the ingredients are almost exactly the same. Right? And it's really a matter of personal preference. It would be really hard for me to describe the differences between the two in any meaningful way that would let someone else make a decision of which one they like better.
Well, let me ask you a couple of questions on that. So I have noticed I see a lot more 36 ACTs than I see 1600s. I just do. And I've talked to some really high-powered schools, and they say the same thing. I talked to one last year. They say we'll have about 12 kids that'll get 36 every year. We'll maybe get 1600. Do you see that as well in your like, I don't know if at the highest end their SATs got either a couple of really hard questions or if it's a grading thing. But to me, I've seen enough to know that it's not a fluke.
I don't know that I believe that. I haven't looked at the numbers because I don't really care about the perfect scores. They don't have problems, right? Like
Sure, I understand.
There's no advocacy that 36 needs, right? So,
right.
It probably has to do with who's sending scores. You're much more likely to see 36s out of the middle of the country, right? Because that's where the ACT is most popular. Right. So I think it probably has something to do with popularity. If I really got curious, I would pull up the national demographics for the last couple of years and see the distribution of scores at each end. I would bet percentile-wise, they're fairly close.
Now, here's another debate I hear, and I've heard this from different test prep people. I've heard some people say that if you're really good at math, the ACT is a better test because it has a few more higher level math type questions than the SAT does. In it, sprinkled in a little more trig, a little more, special types of math. And SAT is basically advanced algebra 2 test. And then I've had other people say, if you're really good at math, you need to take the SAT because it's 50% of your score. Where with the ACT, you got 25% English, 25% reading, 25% science, which is, we know, reading with graphs and stuff, and then 25% math. So people who are actually weaker at math should do the ACT because it's only a quarter of your composite score. Do you have a, and I've like, these are really experienced test prep pros I've heard go at it on this. So do you have a thought on that? You always have a thought, and I can see by the smirk on your face. This time you're wondering how to say it.
Exactly.
Is Akil being PC? Is this a new Akil?
Test prep people, for the most part, see the test through the prism of their clients. And that skews the advice they give. There are very few test prep organizations that look at the test from a research, a pedagogy, and a national perspective. So 30 years in test prep in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, with those kids kind of means nothing about the ACT writ large. And it definitely means nothing about the SAT because they've probably seen 12 kids in 30 years on the SAT, right? So be careful about test prep people who haven't demonstrated that they're giving you information beyond their clientele, right? And also remember that test prep clientele is skews wealthier kind of automatically because you're paying for that service. So even if they're working with low-income students, those are wealthier low-income students because somebody's paying for, like, they have a support system of someone paying for that service, right? So it naturally skews the conversation and perspective, right?
I would think you would probably have an opinion, though. Like if somebody's really weak at math, and if you had to predict
those
they would do better on the ACT or the SAT, would you have thoughts?
Weak at math means nothing. because basically every 11th grader who's taken pre-calculus knows more math than Akil Bello does. And I can do better on the SAT and the ACT than they can. So you could say, if Akil took a pre-calculus class right now, I'd probably get a C or an F. So you might say I'm weak at math, but I can get every SAT question right. So weak at math isn't really quantifiable in terms of a test. Does that mean, like, in terms of these tests, right? So
I mean, you've been doing it for 30 years, so you're the guy.
Right. And that's actually part of the thing, right? Like, I've been doing it for 30 years. So guess what? I'm really good at it because I've seen it all, right? I know SAT and ACT math really well. I don't know math really well. When my current 11th grader entered 9th grade, his first week of school, they did vectors, right? And he asked me for help, and I was like, yeah, I don't know what that is, right? Because now vectors are in the ACT, but like once every 3 tests. Like, it's not often enough, and I could guess my way to an answer, so I never really learned what vectors were. So I was looking at his homework going, well, if you gave me some multiple choice, I could get it right. But I can't actually explain to you what a vector is, right? So, and I think that that's the difference between like good test taker and good at this math content. So when anyone starts to argue this general profile of person is better at one test than the other, which are different, to me, it's again like trying to tell somebody whether they're going to like Coke or Pepsi better. It's just not really, it's not a necessary or worthwhile generalization to make.
So if you're working with someone, do you recommend take a full-blown ACT, take a full-blown SAT, compare? And do you go beyond just looking at score charts and making the call, or do you like look at sort of where they lost their points and incorporate that into the assessment, or is it just look at the tables and whichever one's higher, go with the higher one? If they're the same, go with the one that you like the most. Is that pretty much the approach you take?
I fully expect to be able to, like, if I'm tutoring somebody, I can get almost everybody's score up on any test. Mm-hmm. I'm trying to find the path of least resistance. So if I can get them early enough to take a full practice test of both, then, and I can have, I might just use the score to say, hey, if there's a significant difference, let's start with the one you're better at, and we'll do our work there, right? For early enough that it doesn't really even matter. We can take 2 shots at an ACT, and if it doesn't work out, flip over to the SAT, right? Like, so there's time. So the earlier you begin this, the easier it is to make adjustments as you go. I can dive deeper. I have divin. I made that word up. I have dove
making
deeper.
Words up over here.
Exactly. I like making words up. I made up highly rejective, so
I know that one caught on, didn't it? Caught on.
I mean, you can try to make it fancy scientific analysis, but really at the end of the day, if there's a significant difference in performance, great. That decides where we start, right? If there's a significant preference, that might also decide where we start, right? But for most kids, scores are about the same, and on both tests, right? And so we choose the one that's either popular in their region. I like popular in the region because it makes getting access to resources and advice that much easier. I don't have to explain.
I never really thought of that before. So you're getting reinforcement. Yeah. There's probably more tests even offered or easier, not have to drive as far to get to them, kind of thing.
Yep. So if the scores are close, we're going with whatever's popular, and the student doesn't have a huge preference.
Yeah, because I've always gone with huge preference as the tiebreaker, which I find most students do have a preference. I find most students, they test the same on score tables, but they have a clear preference.
Yeah, but it's often the one that's popular in the region.
That's probably true. I haven't put it through that filter. It probably is. Yeah, because they're probably coming in having heard that name a lot from everything. It probably is a good point. I have to test that out. I like that.
So again, for me, it's really the path of least resistance, right? Because if we choose the test that's not popular in their region, the counselor might tell them the wrong date, right? They might do more research on their own, right? So there's all of that sort of stuff. Like, I mix up ACT and SAT dates all the time, right? Mm-hmm. But, if the school is signing all the kids up for the Saturday May test for the SAT, right, we don't have a whole lot of question about it, right? If you're doing SAT, you're on track with all your classmates, right? Everybody's talking about that test date. If you start to do the ACT, then you have to be a little bit more proactive on your own to get the good information.
Friends, this concludes the second part of my 4-part interview with Akil Bello. We hope you'll join us next week for part 3.
And now it's time for our College Spotlight of the Week.
Friends, last week you heard the first part. Now it's time for the second part.
They do not care about your essays. They do not care about your activities or your recommendations. They look at your grades and they look at your rigor, and that's it. And each school has its own kind of
test
cutoff.
Test scores.
Yeah. Well, he said they're test optional, but if you have a strong test score, that's nice for you to get in.
And I don't know if they're test optional for all majors. That'd be interesting to find that out because I know certain ones want test scores.
Yeah, I believe right now they are. I mean, that could change. That could still be like COVID fallout. But yeah, I mean, and like they want their percentages are like in the high 80s to low 90s. And so they're looking for a strong student. But they don't care if you were president of the Key Club. They just don't care. So, I mean, for a student who is really strong academically and didn't really do a lot else, this might be, an avenue to get a really prestigious education. And it is really a prestigious education, both in the United States and in Canada. I mean,
and around the world.
Yeah.
Our
tour guide was telling us that there are so many companies in Canada that will only hire McGill graduates. They're entirely staffed with McGill graduates. And so having that on your resume is extremely helpful in Canada. And then if you are an American student and you do go to a Canadian school, then you can get a work visa after you graduate. And so you can use it as a pathway to remain in Canada if that's something that you're interested in.
And there's been a lot of students that have been taking that advantage of that recently.
Yeah.
Because that really is true. Like that's, yeah, I mean, it really does work. And that's true for most of your other Canadian schools, not just McGill. Like you get this work visa so you can actually work while you're there, like and make good money and then stay on if you want.
Yeah. It is a big school and we were there during graduation because graduation takes
What's with you in graduation? You had the same thing in High Point, remember? I guess it's just the season.
Festive.
It's
I'm
the season.
Very festive. I like a party. They like to have a good time. But no, so they had all these tents with, in the main lawn of the campus, and there are different graduations going on. And every I would say 45 seconds, you hear an enormous cheer, like for the entire time we were there. And we were there for like 4 hours.
Wow.
And that was just one day of the 2-week graduation. And so our tour guide, he was really one of the best tour guides I've ever had, I have to say. My daughter, Sonia, was with me, and she really ate up everything that he said. I mean, he made a big impact on her, and he just gave the kids a lot of advice, not just a tour of McGill, but a tour of adulthood. I would say. But he said, I'll be honest with you, for the first 2 years, you're a number to these people. And the only way you cannot be a number is to make them know your name. And so that's what he decided that he needed to do, was to make sure everyone knew his name, all of his professors, all of his TAs. And he's very successful now with that.
I tell people at any of these schools where you have really big classes, sit up front too. Maybe, okay, you don't have to do the first row. Nobody likes to do that, but do the second or third row. Because it's like if you go, you have some control over, a lot of control over how quality your education is. Do you, like you said, do you seek out the TAs and get to know people? Do you sit up front or do you linger at the back?
Yeah. Yeah. And so, I mean, if you're going to go to McGill, I think you need to sit at the front. That would be my advice. And, I would say inside the buildings, it was pretty run down. I mean, I went to the University of Chicago. I went to college a long time ago, but there were a lot of really run down buildings, and at Northwestern too, quite frankly. It felt very homey to me and similar to that. But when I go to other schools, they do not look like that in the United States. They are. Everything looks just so, everything is clean and beautiful and the paint is fresh. It was not like that at McGill.
Well, and I don't want to get off on a tangent, but a lot of times I'm going to do a little bit here. It's a little bit of a grind my gears. A lot of times, people say, why is college so expensive? Well, part of it is because what people are demanding now is very different than when we went. What they want in the way of dorms and rec centers and not to mention some of the things which we all agree you should have, whether it's mental health or academic services or career supports, but just facilities alone, all the different food, those things aren't cheap.
No.
So, yeah.
Yeah. And, if you contrast High Point, where I'd recently been, to McGill, it's quite the contrast. I would say those are kind of the two extremes on the appearance of the campus. I mean, and you mentioned food. you have to get a meal plan your first year at McGill, and it's meh, is sort of the impression that I got. People are very happy to get out and, start cooking or eating at all the great restaurants that are in Montreal. I had 2 kids with me, so I pulled them after this. So Sonia, who is the rising sophomore, really liked McGill, actually more than she thought she would. She's not generally a city person, but she could see, she liked the atmosphere. She's a very independent student, very self-motivated. So I think she's the kind of person who, if she knew what she wanted to do, could hack it in that kind of situation, although she is kind of shy, so she'd have to work on that. But she said it is way, way, way too cold for me. I mean, in fact, and these are kids who are born in Illinois, right? They're wandering around. It was raining one day and it was like 55. And like, this is the coldest that I have ever been in my life.
That's what happens. You move to North Carolina, you get soft.
I know. I absolutely know that is not true. Not true. Now, my son, and it's just so funny to see all the different kids and how they are at the tour, because so many, there was one girl, I think she was from Ohio, and she wouldn't stand next to her mom, and her mom was getting really upset. I'm like, listen, this is just how they are. Don't take it personally. They're really nervous. My daughter's sort of in the middle, and my son is reading the lookbook, the view book, and he's like, I think I'm going to pick out this major and go here and live in this dorm. But he's 11, so it's a
he's a very advanced 11, Mr. Thomas.
But yeah, he wanted to go to the McDonald campus and study wildlife biology. That's what he thought he would like to do. But who knows if he'll actually do that. Sonia said, and this just made me laugh, that she'd rather go to UNC Wilmington. And I thought, how many people actually compare McGill and UNC Wilmington? She might be the only human being in existence, but that's how cold it was and how much she didn't like it. So, I mean, who do I think that McGill would be good for? If you are a driven student, you're outgoing, you're comfortable with talking to people, grown-ups by that, I mean grown-up people, and asking for help, and you're good at networking, you will probably thrive in this environment. If you know what you want to do, you know what you want to major in, and you are comfortable asking for help and making connections, you're going to do great there. And money is a factor. If you're that kind of person, and you could succeed anywhere, and you can pay $31,000 to $35,000 a year for your college experience, it's definitely something to consider. And also, you have to like it cold and dark. If you don't like it cold and dark, I could see seasonal affective disorder being a very serious thing for you. But I don't think it's going to be good for kids who are maybe on the immature side. Just everyone develops at a different rate. So immature isn't even fair. Slower to develop kid, a shy kid, I don't think they have any support that I could tell for learning differences, autism, or ADHD. That's something that you would have to get outside help for. And then my notes are, that it's not good for people who need sunshine and hate the snot in their nose freezing. So, because that's how cold it gets there.
I think for a lot of Americans, the adventuresome kid and kid who is pretty good at adjusting, because it is pretty countercultural in a lot of ways. Like just Montreal, it's so French speaking. I know I would be frustrated when I'd be back there because, well, a lot of people know, but the French English divide is really intense, and they almost
that was really
broke away,
from
the country back in I guess around 1990. It was really, really intense. It's almost like their black white over there is like French English, and I remember going there, and I would get so frustrated because they would have French-only signs everywhere. And so it's just going to be countercultural. Now, there's going to be someone who loves that, loves the culture and loves all that, but for somebody else, and then some of the things you said, like not really having the sports and the fraternities, and then just the lack of coddling isn't the right word, but maybe the non-nurturing environment.
Sink or swim, I think.
Sink or swim. So I just think it does require somebody who's a little adventuresome and is pretty good at transitions.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point that you bring up about the French English divide, because, in our sort of, tourist activities, we heard a lot about that. And it seems like people were very divided until the 1960s. And until that point, French children couldn't go to English schools. And I sort of I heard from a lot of people who were of French descent, and I sort of started to understand their hostility towards even the language of English because of all of the things that were imposed on them when the English took over that area. But it is really interesting to see that. And I don't know, everyone must think I'm French because everyone always spoke to me in French. And I took 3 months of French in college and I haven't used it at all. So it was, I had to perfect my dumb look, and then they'd be like, oh, and switch to English. So, but by the end of it, I was starting to pick up most of what they were saying, which was not very complicated. It's things like pay me now or things like that. But, it was culturally, I felt that it was kind of a breath of fresh air to me, though, being in Montreal and Quebec City, because there just wasn't this feeling of divisiveness that I feel in the United States. We went to some museums, and even in Quebec City, I will tell you, and I mean this in the most affectionate way, I went to the wokest museum I've ever been to. It was so progressive, and the ideas that they presented about, the First Nation people or the Native Americans of Canada. It was just amazing how respectful they were of all people. That felt really nice to me. It would not be for some people, but and then while I was there on the last day, the Donald Trump indictment news came out. And honestly, we were all sitting in the airport on the last day, and we didn't really even want to go back to the United States because, like, oh man, there's just going to be so much arguing back at home. And here everything is just, peaceful, and we're not there's not just a sense of constant controversy and disunion. So I think it could be kind of good in that way for students, if that's something that really bothers them, to go to some place where they're a little bit removed from some of the conflicts in American society right now.
Well, one of the things that we know working with students is there's just a lot of angst around gun violence, especially if people have had an incident in their school, or maybe not even their school, maybe it touched a cousin or a relative or something. And, Lisa, we work with people like that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I know you worked with someone that went through the Newtown shooting, and they were like, I got to get out of here. And so in general, Canada's safe that way because
absolutely
660 deaths for the whole gun deaths for the whole country. Like there's, U.S. cities that have more than that. And so I think some of what you're picking up too might just be some of the safety.
Yeah.
Safety
that's the thing.
gives you a good vibe. Yeah.
Well, you don't know how much energy you're putting into like kind of dealing with something that's always there until it's taken away. And I would absolutely say that for safety, because it's not like I'm walking around Chapel Hill thinking I'm going to get shot at every day. But if I go into like a crowded theater, I'm looking for the exit now. And I never would have even thought of that before. Like the thought is always in my mind. When I was in Canada, I just went wherever and I didn't think about it. And it felt great.
I can relate to that. I remember being at Joy's graduation at North Carolina State, and you're in the big giant Coliseum where they play that. They play the basketball games, and I had that thought, like that's now a conscious thing that's on your mind.
Right.
It never used to be like, what would stop somebody, some crazy person with a gun, could just end this whole thing. So yeah, that is like one of those constant stressors in the back of your mind.
Yeah. And so, if you don't like that, then going to McGill might be a really nice thing for you, and you just have to pay with the coldness. That's all. So
anything at all on their application?
They didn't really talk too much about their application. I have helped a student with it online. And I think like it's pretty simple. Sometimes some Canadian schools, and I can't remember if this is Toronto or McGill, require a 2-minute video interview. I think it might be Toronto, but it's all very straightforward. It's not like American applications, but it's mostly your transcript and then your test scores if you have them, and that's all.
Well, this was great, Lisa. Thanks for going international for us.
Well, it's fun for me, so I'm glad I could report back.
Awesome. All right, take care. Friends, on Monday's episode, we have a brand new interview. But before we get to the brand new interview, as promised, I will be talking about the other major Supreme Court decision that happened at the end of the term, late June, where student loan forgiveness, Biden's plan, was rejected along partisan lines 6-3. And so we'll be diving into that, talking a little bit about the decision and what that means for college students. And as mentioned, we'll have a brand new interview Lisa will be doing, and it's with 2 psychologists 2 clinical psychologists. There's going to be a lot of brain power in that one interview. 3 clinical psychologists, Dr. Sarah Olivo and Dr. Liz Seidler, will also join our own Dr. Lisa Ruff to discuss a few things, but they specialize in college student mental health. So you have a podcast called College is Fine, Everything's Fine. And they'll be talking about student mental health over the next few episodes. So that'll be a 3-parter that you'll hear. And as promised, I'm giving you 10 quotes for 10 consecutive weeks that are all in my book, 171 Answers to the Most Asked College Admissions Questions. Just 10 of my favorite quotes that I put in the start of the book. This is one of my absolute favorites. Those who are listening to this who work with me have probably heard me say this to you many times. So here it is. Nobody cares what your activities are at all. All they care is that you care what your activities are. Did you get that? That's kind of deep. Nobody cares what your activities are at all. All they care is that you care what your activities are. That's from Arun Ponusami, who's a former admission officer at a number of places. But I'm going to list one, the University of Chicago, and I'm going to list that because as soon as I hit send on this, I'm heading straight to the University of Chicago, which is about 2 blocks from Dave's house, where I'm still staying at Dave's house right now. So I'll mention University of Chicago, but he's actually worked in Caltech and other places as well. So hopefully you'll join us on Monday for that. See you on Monday, friends. And that's our show. A big thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning in this week. If you find this podcast helpful, please follow us and you'll get every single episode as soon as it is released. If you're interested, there are a few ways you can really support our podcast. You can click the share button and send it to your friends and acquaintances. You can help us pay our staff and our expenses by donating on our website. You can write a review for us on Apple or Spotify. I'm the producer of the podcast, but we have a fantastic team of 15. Shout out to our co-host, Dr. Lisa Ruff, Dr. David Williams, Linda Depker, Susan Tree, Vince Garcia, and Julia Esquivel. And to our substitute co-host, Sylvia Borgo. Our sensational sound engineer is Nemanja Motvich. Our amazing music is from Victor Allen Weeks. Marketing designs are from Kimberly Glass. Lily Parikh manages our Instagram. Our image editor is Talha Khan. Joy Stucker does our website episode updates. And our webmaster is Stylianos Dimitriou. And if you want to have a coaching session with Lisa, Linda, or me, just text me at 404-664-4340. If you have a question you want us to answer, or if you have a recommended resource or article you think we should discuss, just send it to questions@yourcollegeboundkid.com. Our favorite method is for you to record your own voice at speakpipe.com/YCBK. By the way, check out our website where you'll find lots of content that is not on any podcast app. Our website is yourcollegeboundkid.com. If you want to learn about other hot admissions topics, follow us on Twitter at YCBK Podcasts. We think of you as our listening family, and we look forward to meeting again with you every single Monday and Thursday.